All right, we are now recording. This is I think our 26th, I guess, uh, Bible study on the book of Acts. We've only got 28 chapters, except next week's could be a 2-weeker. I've taken a pretty good look at it, and it's pretty long, but then it's really interesting, I think. So, okay, so Paul has been in prison between Jerusalem and Caesarea. He's been in prison several years. And he finally finds himself on his way to Rome. And this had been his goal since he had arrived in Ephesus many years earlier. It's now about 60 AD, about 29 or 30 years after Jesus Christ's crucifixion. And Luke is still with him, as verse 1 will show us. Now here's a map of, I've got to move something here just a second. Hello, Robert. Here is a map of the projected or suspected, or this is Paul's trek to Rome from Jerusalem. And we're going to come back to this map a whole bunch of times tonight, because when they say we arrived at such and such, I didn't do it every time, but a lot of times I'll come back to this map and we'll talk about where they are. So we're going to begin tonight in Acts chapter 27. And Paul, or Luke, is writing this, and he said that they decided that we, and anytime you see we in the book of Acts, that means that Luke is with whoever it is he's talking about, and it's generally talking about Paul. But when it was decided that we were going to go to Italy, to Rome, they delivered Paul and other prisoners, and they named the centurion. I don't really know why, but they named him, and a centurion was a Roman commander of 100 soldiers. Now it says he was of the Augustan regiment. If you remember a couple of weeks ago, you know what, that may have been on the Sabbath study, but Augustan means the imperial, the honored regiment. And there were at least two reasons, as a general rule, there were at least two reasons for a prisoner to be shipped to Rome. One, like Paul, was that there was a capital offense, or he'd been accused of a capital offense, and a Roman citizen would appeal to be heard before Caesar. The other reason, and I'm not saying there were only two, but I'm only going to mention two. The other was that they were being taken to fight in the Colosseum as a gladiator, which is not a reason that you want to be taken to Rome, I can assure you that. This particular ship probably had both types of prisoners on board. Okay, I've got a little note here, but I'm going to skip that. Verse 2. So they entered a ship of Adramyttium, and that was a Greek city on the coast of Aeola in Asia Minor. And I'm not sure that I found that one, but he says they put to sea, and they meant to sail along the coast of Asia, because as we will find out, it's late in the year and the storms are out there in the sea. And Luke talks about Aristarchus, who was he was a Macedonian from Thessalonica, and he was with them. And here's the map again. And I did have it too. Here's however you pronounce that word. It's right up here. It's real close to Troas. If you know where Troas is, it's like right here. It's here or here, because it was one of the ports where they would sail over to Macedonia from this area up here. Okay, now Expositor's Bible Commentary says this, talking about a Roman citizen. As a Roman citizen, talking about Paul, who had appealed to the emperor, Paul would naturally have had a more favored position than the other prisoners, and the centurion would have recognized his superiority as a gentleman with attendants. So, Paul had some of his friends with him. We know Luke was with him, and we know that Aristarchus was with him, and we're not sure who else. He may talk about it later on, but anyway, so it says the next day they landed at Sidon, and if you see, they've left from down here, and when they left from Caesarea, they went by ship, and they landed at Sidon, which is right here. You remember Tyre and Sidon? Well, this is Sidon. It says the next day we landed at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him liberty to go to his friends. So, Paul had friends in Sidon. As a matter of fact, Philip was down in the general area, and there was a church or churches in the area, and so Paul was allowed to get off the ship. He probably had a soldier or two with him, but he was able to go to his friends and receive care. Then it says, when we put to sea from there, we sailed under the shelter of Cyprus because the winds were contrary. Okay, so here's the map again, and they sailed north of Cyprus under shelter. In other words, Cyprus was blocking the winds. The island blocked the winds for them. So they're going on a northerly route here up to Myra. And we're going to see when we get down to verse 9 that they sailed after the fast, after the Day of Atonement. So those of us who observe the feast days know that that's late fall. So winds came out of the west that time of the year. Okay, so winds are coming from here this way, and they're sailing against the wind, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Now, if you've seen the America's Cup race, have any of y'all ever watched any of the America's Cup race?
I'm not a sports person. Is that sports?
Yeah, it's a sailing race.
And, yeah, Judy and I both watched some of it.
Yeah, you'll see the boats go back and forth to work with the wind. It's called tacking. And don't ask me any more questions. That's the limit of my sailing knowledge. But I did look really hard, and I finally found a map that I think shows us the tacking that they did. See all of these up and back and up and back and up and back. I believe this is an example of them tacking because the winds were against them. And so, they would go north for a little ways, and then they'd go back down south and go and pick up the wind again and go up north and so on. And they'd work their sails so that they could sail against the wind. Those of us who are not sailors, kind of look at it and go, how can they sail against the wind? Well, they do it by tacking. So there again, that's the end of my knowledge of sailing. Well, that's not true. You have to have a sail, and you have to have a boat. That's it. Okay. Verse 5. Luke says, when we, again, Luke is with Paul here. He's on the ship with Paul and with Paul's other companions. When we had sailed over the sea, which is off Cilicia and Pamphylia, and that's up north up here. That's right up in here. We came to Myra, a city of Lycia, and there the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing to Italy, and he put us on board. The conjecture here is that the ship that they left from Sidon was a smaller ship and would not have been able to make the trip to Rome. So they found an Alexandrian ship, a bigger ship, and we will see that a little bit later when we see who was on board and so on. Now, verse 7 takes us to an interesting spot. It says, when we had sailed slowly many days. Now, why are they going slowly? Because they're fighting against the wind. And we arrived with difficulty off Cnidus, the wind not permitting us to proceed. So it was so strong they couldn't even tack at this particular point. It says, we sailed under the shelter of Crete off Salmone, and I'll come back to that in just a minute with the map. Passing it with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens near the city of Lasea. Now, so here they are right down in here. Here is Crete. This island here is Crete. And those of you who read mythology, Greek mythology, Roman mythology, mostly Greek mythology, like I did when I was in high school, I just loved it. I didn't know. I didn't understand what I was reading and how pagan it was and all that. But anyway, any of you who read that, Crete was a site of a lot of the things. The Cyclops was there, and maybe the Medusa, but what was the guy's name that was the sailor? Well, anyway, it doesn't matter. That's all the pagan stuff. Well, there's an interesting thing about Crete. Some of the residents of Crete left Crete and went to another area of the Mideast, and they became known as Philistines. So the Philistines, or the Philistines, David and Goliath and so on, they had come from Crete. Now, we talked about Crete quite a bit the last couple of Sabbaths. The citizens of Crete were, how do I say this? I'll just use skip vernacular, low-life scumbags. They were thieves. They were murderers. They were the worst of the worst. Philosophers from Crete would actually write about how bad Cretans were. Okay? So think about that. They went from Crete, and they sailed over, and they inhabited the area that we call Palestine, actually, the Philistines. This is before the Israelites settled the land, before the 20 years and so on. So the Jewish Virtual Library says this: Philistines are referred to as the descendants of Casluchim in Genesis 10 and Exodus 13. If you want to write those down, I'll pause for just a second. They were known as a seafaring nation, Genesis 10 and Exodus 13. The Philistines were non-Semitic people. They were not from that area. They left Crete and arrived in Canaan at the beginning of the 12th century before Christ. The Philistines inhabited the Mediterranean coast of Canaan during the period of the book of Judges. They founded 5 principalities: Gaza, Ascalon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. Their highly developed weapons brought a great threat to the Israelites. During the Exodus from Egypt, the Israelites purposely took a southern route to circumvent them. They didn't want to get anywhere near them. They were mean. They were well armed. They were well trained. The Philistines often battled against the Israelites. And we all know the first king of Israel, Saul, temporarily weakened them, but later, David defeated them after his battle with Goliath. The Philistines were reduced to many commercial ventures rather than military ventures. After Israel conquered them, and then we read about them throughout the book of Kings and so on. But I just thought it was really interesting that the Philistines came from Crete. Now, the name Palestine originates from the Philistine inhabitants of the land of Judea. And after the Romans conquered that region in the 2nd century before Christ, the Romans used the term Palestina to refer to the region in an attempt to minimize Jewish attachment to the land. I thought that was kind of interesting. And all of that was from the Jewish Virtual Library. Okay, so where are we? The fast was verse 9, when much time had been spent. And the reason they spent a lot of time was because the wind was against them. It took them a long time. It says sailing was dangerous because the Day of Atonement was already over. And Paul advised them, saying, men, and they didn't listen to him, by the way, I perceive that this voyage will end with disaster and much loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also our lives. In other words, he was saying, we need to stay put. If we try to cross the ocean right now, we're in trouble. We're in big trouble. Verse 11, the centurion was more persuaded by the helmsman and the owner of the ship, who had cargo. He wanted to get over there, he wanted to get it unloaded, he wanted to get his money. So he was more interested in what the helmsman and the owner of the ship had to say than the things spoken by Paul. Looking back, that was not a wise choice. Verse 12, because the harbor was not suitable to winter in, and that is down here in Fair Havens, in this area, there wasn't really a big enough cove for them to winter in. So they set sail, said the majority, I guess they talked about it, maybe even voted. They set sail from there also, hoping to reach Phoenix, a harbor on the other side of Crete that opened toward the southwest and northwest, and winter there. Here's the map again. That was over in this area here. Actually, it may have been up even in here. You can see that there would have been some safety there, but that didn't work, because what happened was the south wind blew softly. The storm settled down. The winds quit blowing so hard. And they supposed that I guess prayers had been answered or whatever, however they looked at it. It says they had obtained their desire, and they put out to sea and they sailed close by Crete. Here we are again. You can see from Fair Havens, they're starting to go a little south, and then they're going to turn north. But not long after, a tempestuous headwind arose called Euroclydon. Now, Euroclydon has commonly been interpreted as a compound word. Euros, meaning southeast wind, and kludon means waves. Thus, the name was understood as signifying a southeast wind stirring up great waves. So it says, verse 15, when the ship was caught and couldn't head into the wind, we let her drive. What that means is we let go of the helm and let the winds blow us where they wanted. We couldn't fight against it. We couldn't use our sails. They probably brought their sails down and they just let the winds blow the ship wherever the winds wanted to blow the ship. It's almost like the wind was playing tricks on the captain, because the captain, yeah, it's kind of tough. We might want to sit here. Oh, wait a minute. The winds have died down. Let's go. But it was so calm that they decided to put out to sea. Now, the preacher's outlook, POSB, preachers, I can't remember what it stands for. Anyway, it's a good commentary. The deceptive calm. All of a sudden, nature seemed to favor the decision of the worldly men. A soft, calm breeze began to blow out of the south. The crew quickly loosed anchor and set sail, sailing as close to the shoreline as possible just in case their fate changed course. And then they go on, they say, and change course it did. Just when nature seemed to be blessing them, the old enemy, the violent Euroclydon, the violent northeasterly storm blew in. It came unexpectedly, so suddenly that the ship could not be turned to face the wind. It was a typhoon-like storm with engulfing, swallowing power, and it drove the ship out into the sea, making control utterly impossible. Verse 16. Oh, well, let me go back to the map. You can see how it drove them quite a bit south down toward Africa, and then they started tacking, as I showed you in the map a minute ago, and right up to the point they were shipwrecked. But anyway, verse 16 says, and running under the shelter of an island called Clauda, we secured the skiff with difficulty. You can see Clauda just south of Crete there. Now, a skiff, verse 16 said, and running under the shelter of an island called Clauda, we secured the skiff with difficulty. The skiff is the small boat that's attached to the big ship, and they had trouble securing it. It was blowing around, and you've probably seen movies with storms and so on, and the lifeboats swinging back and forth. Now, what you find, go back here, when looking a short distance to the south, is the continent of Africa. Libya particularly sticks out. Now let me go to that map. You see, here's Libya right here, and you can see how close they were to Libya. And verse 17, checking my notes here. Yeah, when they had taken it on board, talking about the skiff, the lifeboat, they used cables to undergird the ship. In other words, the ship was about to shake apart. So they literally wrapped the entire ship with cables. And they feared lest they should run aground on the Syrtis sands. And the Syrtis sands are are right down in here. They were afraid that they would run aground in Africa. And so they struck sail and so were driven. In other words, they were still being manipulated because of the winds, but they were tacking. Verse 18, it says, because we were exceedingly tempest tossed, the next day they lightened the ship. In other words, they threw, I'm sure the owner of the ship was just really pleased with this. You know, he refused to stay back where it was safe. He wanted to get the cargo where it was supposed to go and sell it. Well, now it's being thrown out into the ocean. Verse 19, it says, on the third day, we threw the ship's tackle overboard with our own hands. So they made the ship lighter. They were afraid they were going to sink. Apparently, the ship had some heavy cargo. And to keep from being submerged, they got rid of some of it. Now, in verse 20, it talks about, you know, they were in the middle of the storm for a long time. They didn't see the sun or the stars for many days. And no small tempest beat on us. It was a rough storm. All hope that we would be saved was finally given up. Now, it's interesting, the word we here. I wonder if Luke wasn't one that lost hope, lost his faith. Paul didn't, as we will see in a few scriptures. But Luke apparently gave up and lost his faith. Now, I'm not going to criticize him because I've never been in a situation where it looks like my life was about to end. Well, maybe when I saw the truck about to run over me, I might have been a little scared, but that didn't last long because I was unconscious pretty well immediately. But other than that, well, maybe when I lost control of the car and I thought I was going to slam into ongoing traffic, you know, well, or maybe when I fell out of the tree with an 8-inch butcher knife in my hand. Don't climb a tree with an 8-inch butcher knife. That's a lesson for you all. Of course, I was 9 years old, 10, 12, whatever. But seriously, I've never felt the kind of fear and hopelessness these men felt as their ship was being tossed around. Some of you all have probably been in tornadoes, certainly have been in storms, so you know exactly what these guys were feeling. Maybe not as serious, but you knew what they were feeling. By the way, does anybody have anything to say?
Yeah, we've been out here on this lake.
Yeah.
Been in 5 and 6 foot waves on a pontoon boat that you know, the deck was only 3 feet off the water. So, but not for as long as them, and hadn't lost hope. But
well, you felt a little of what they felt then, didn't you?
Oh, it's yeah. I mean, it's scary when, you know, when the waves are twice as high as the flotation on your boat. It can get a little nervous, and what you did is you turned and you went with the waves. You went with the wind. The same thing they did. You know, you don't go into it. You sure don't get sideways to it, or it'll tip you over.
Right.
I mean, literally some, you know, 10 or 15 pretty scary minutes, I'll tell you.
I bet. How many of you have been seasick or car sick? I'm sure I'm not the only one. I got car sick one time. We were in Memphis and I was in the back seat of the car, and I'm telling you, all of a sudden I thought I was going to die. And that had never happened before. But how much food do you think these guys are going to eat while this ship is being tossed around like a little toy boat in a bathtub? And that's what Paul says in verse 21. But after long abstinence from food. Now, it says that they didn't see the sun or stars for many days, and so they were being tossed around for many days. And then Paul stood up in the midst of them and said, "Men, you should have listened to me and not have sailed from Crete and incurred this disaster and loss." Now, Paul was not, I don't think, saying, "I told you so." I don't believe that he was. He's giving them hope. None of them will lose their lives. This is what he's going to, in the next few scriptures. And, he tells them that they're only going to lose the ship. And we can see by what he tells them that he was given a very detailed message by the Holy Spirit, by God. Verse 22. And now take heart. Don't worry, for nobody is going to die. But the ship is. Ship's in big trouble. For there stood by me this night an angel, or I prefer the word messenger, which is the correct pronunciation, correct definition. An angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve, saying, "Do not be afraid, Paul. You must be brought before Caesar. And indeed, God has granted you all those who sail with you. Therefore, don't be afraid, guys. Take heart, for I believe God, and it will be just as it was told to me. However," here's the bad, that was the good news. Here's the bad news. I've got good news and bad news. Here's the good news. Here's the bad news. However, we are going to run aground on a certain island. Now, when the 14th night had come, so they've been at this for 2 weeks. They hadn't eaten anything for like 13 days. As we were driven up and down in the Adriatic Sea, about midnight, the sailors sensed that they were drawing near some land. Now, the Adriatic Sea is actually further north, and there's no telling how things were named back then, but the Adriatic Sea is more over in this area here, at the beginning at the foot of Italy and running up here. Here's what we call the Adriatic Sea today. But now, in those days, this could have been the Adriatic Sea right through here. Doesn't really matter. So you've probably seen movies where they tested the depth. They would drop a weighted small anchor or something in, and they would count how deep it was. So in verse 28, it's what it says. They took soundings, and they found it to be 20 fathoms. And when they had gone a little farther, they took soundings and found out it was only 15. So they knew they were getting close to land. Verse 29, then, fearing that they were going to run aground on the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. It was dark. The water was shallow. They knew the ship was about to hit rock and break up and drown everybody on board. So they dropped 4 anchors to hold the ship away from the rocks. And then something interesting happened. The sailors were trying to jump in the skiff, and they let down the skiff under the pretense of putting out anchors from the prow. In other words, they were going to take anchors a little farther out. That wasn't it. They were trying to escape. And Paul grabbed hold of the centurion and said, "Unless these men stay in the ship, you're not going to be saved." God said, "Stay on the ship." Verse 32, they're finally beginning to believe what Paul tells them. And so the soldiers cut away the ropes of the skiff and they let it fall off. So now they have they're all on the big ship. There's no escape. They have finally listened to Paul. It's worth noting that the centurion believed Paul and didn't let anyone get in the skiff. Okay, verse 33. And as day was about to dawn, Paul implored them all to take food. Okay, guys, it's settled down enough. You hadn't eaten in 2 weeks. You got to eat. You got to have your strength. Today is the 14th day. It's been 2 weeks, and you've had absolutely nothing. And they've probably thrown up quite a bit. Verse 34. So I urge you to eat, for this is for your survival, because God has told me none of you are going to die. Not a hair will fall from your head. And when Paul had said these things, he took bread. He gave thanks to God in the presence of them all. And when he had broken it, he began to eat. Then they were all encouraged and also took food for themselves. Finally, they all began to believe Paul and started following his directions. Now, a while ago, I told you this was a big ship and that I would show you a little bit later how big it was. If you remember, they took a lot of the cargo and they threw it off. Well, guess what? There were 276 people on the ship. Now, those of you who've been to a feast that's in the 250 to 300 range, think of the room that you were in. Those of you who went to Land Between the Lakes, last year we had 270 people. Not this past feast, we had 360, but last year. And so imagine how big the ship has to be for all of us to be on it. 276 people plus cargo. Verse 38. So when they had eaten enough, they threw some more cargo off. And it says, and they threw out the wheat into the sea. So they had some crops. But the wheat was probably ruined. That's conjecture on my part, but I don't think salt water and wheat mix too well. So their plan was to make the ship as light as possible to avoid some of the rocks, because they're going to try to get a little closer in to land. Verse 39 says, when it was day, they didn't know where they were. They'd just been blown around for 2 weeks. They had no idea where they were, but they saw a bay. And the bay had a beach, and they planned to run the ship aground on the beach. So they let go the anchors, they cut them loose, left the anchors in the sea, and they loosed the rudder ropes, the ropes that they had tied the rudder up with, and they hoisted the mainsail to the wind and made for shore. Now the Hallman Bible Commentary said this: in the morning they saw a small bay where they planned to run the ship aground, but they never made it. Striking a sandbar, the stern was broken up in the surf, and that's what it says in verse 41. And you'll see where I've made put some words bold in here. It says, but striking a place where the two seas met, they ran the ship aground, and the prow stuck fast and remained immovable. But the stern was being broken up by the violence of the waves. So what's going on here? What two seas did met where their ship was? Well, we just read that there was a beach and it was calm, but their ship was out in the heavy seas. So the two seas were the calm on one side of the ship, and the not calm, the rocky waves on the other side. And I think that's what Luke was talking about when he said where the two seas met. They were stuck in the middle. And when the front of the ship stuck fast and didn't move, but the rear of the ship was being broken up by the violence of the waves, kept getting hit just like this. And I looked, by the way, the first time I went through this, I looked to see if there were two seas, but I couldn't find anything having to do with this. Finally, I came to understand that it wasn't talking about two seas or two oceans or whatever per se, but a sea on each side of the grounded ship. On one side, the water was calm, but on the other, the sea was violent. Hence, the prow being safe, but the stern being battered and broken up by the violence of the waves, as verse 41 says. Now, verse 42 would be a little scary if you were on the ship. Now, remember, there's 276 men on there. Probably more than half of them were prisoners. So it was the soldiers' plan to kill the prisoners. Why? Lest any of them should swim away and escape. Roman military law decreed that a guard who allowed his prisoner to escape could expect the same penalty the escaped prisoner would have suffered. I'm reading this from Expositor's Commentary. Hence, the soldiers wanted to kill the prisoners, lest they escape while getting to land. But Julius, who was the head of this special cohort, if you will, he was a centurion, he was determined to protect Paul. And he prevented this and ordered all to get to land either by swimming or by holding on to pieces of the wreckage. So God, in his providence, brought them all safely to shore, as he had promised Paul that he would. Many, like Luke, undoubtedly saw the relation between the promise and their safety, and in their own ways they praised the God that Paul served. They weren't Christians, but they understood that Paul's God was stronger than their God. So, verse 43, it says, but the centurion, wanting to save Paul, kept them from their purpose, didn't let them kill the prisoners, and commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land. And the rest, some on boards, some on parts of the ship. And so it was that they all escaped safely to land. Just exactly what God had sent his messenger to tell Paul was going to happen, that they were all going to be safe if they didn't get in the skiff and try to save themselves. And that's the last verse in chapter 27, but I'm going to give you verse 20, chapter 28:1. It says, now when they had escaped, they found out that the island was called Malta. Here's Malta, right over here. So they've made it, going up, sailing from Sidon down below Crete. Then the storms really hit hard and they tacked back and forth. And finally they just turned the ship loose, threw a bunch of stuff overboard, and sat down or laid down. There wasn't anything they could do. They hung on to whatever they could hang on to. Some of them probably tied themselves to the ship, but they ended up coming over to the island of Malta. And we'll talk about Malta next week, but I've got a little bit more to say about this. Malta is only about 18 miles long and 8 miles wide. It lies 58 miles south of Sicily. You can see Sicily here, right here. And 180 miles north of the east of the African coast, right here. It had been colonized about 1000 BC by Phoenicians, but Rome captured it in 218 BC. Augustus Caesar established a Roman governor on the island of Malta and settled a number of army veterans and their families there. So this was basically a place for retired Roman soldiers to spend the rest of their lives, and they were taken care of. In Paul's day, the island was known for its prosperity and residential architecture. There was a lot of building that went on, a lot of homes. And its native population, the natives of Malta, spoke a Phoenician dialect, though many probably knew a little bit of Latin and Greek. In conclusion, I'm going to read a little bit more from the Preacher's Outline and Sermon Bible Commentary. God's messenger was shipwrecked but saved. Speaking of Paul. God had promised to save Paul, and he did. God had also saved everyone else on the ship, but there were terrible trials. Trials so threatening that only God could have saved his messenger. And here's some of the things that happened to him. The violent storm, which mercilessly drove the ship under its own ferocious power for 2 weeks, for 14 days. The utter hopelessness of the situation. They all knew they were lost. Everyone except Paul had lost all hope of being saved. The attempted abandonment of the ship by the sailors to save their own lives, which would have doomed all of them to shipwreck and death. And then the last thing was that the soldiers planned to kill all the prisoners, including Paul, to prevent their escape. The point is, as I'm sure all of you know, God promised to deliver Paul, and God kept his promise. He always does. So that's all I've got for tonight. Comments? Corrections? Questions? Whatever. Okay. As far as I know, next Tuesday, let me look at my calendar here real quick. Let me stop the recording.